Hi, this is Katie Green.
Hi, and I'm Dan Green, and welcome back to the Greening Out podcast. Today we're doing episode 2 of our interview series, and we're joined by Keith Preston. Keith Preston is the author of 2 books, including Attack the System, A New Anarchist Perspective for the 21st Century, and El Salvador, A War by Proxy. Keith is also the founder of AttackTheSystem.com and host of the Attack the System podcast series. Hi, Keith.
Hello, Dan. Katie, thanks for having me.
Hi, we're very, very honored that you actually wanted to come on our show. So it's absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. So, why don't you start by telling us a bit about your background and how you got into anarchism?
Okay. Well, that goes back a good number of years. I first heard of anarchism when I was in high school, which would have been over 30 years ago. And from the first time I ever heard of the concept of anarchism, I thought it was a rather intriguing idea. The way I heard about it was in my high school English literature class when we were covering the poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley. I remember reading very casually that Shelley had been the son-in-law of William Godwin, an anarchist, and I remember thinking, "Wow, there's really such people as anarchists. That's interesting. I wonder what that's about." And I didn't really think much about it for a few years after that until I was in college. And I remember when I was in my early 20s, and I was at the age that a lot of people are when they start getting interested in philosophy and politics and all these different kinds of things that college students get into. I started thinking about all these different ideologies, communism and capitalism and socialism and all these kinds of things. And I started thinking, what about that anarchism thing? What's all that about? So I started looking more into that and reading up on it and seeing what I could find about it. And the more I read about it, the more interesting I thought it was. And then I actually started seeking out people who were interested in anarchism and started getting involved with anarchist groups of different kinds, and this was in the 80s. And the world back then was a little bit different than it is now. We didn't have the internet and things like that, so if you wanted to meet anarchists, you had to go find them in person. You couldn't find them online because there was no online. So I got involved with anarchist groups of different types, and back in those days, I was a part of the left-wing anarchist scene, which was smaller than it is now. It was similar to this kind of stuff that you see nowadays with Occupy, and about 10 years ago, there was the anti-globalization movement. I was into stuff like that before it became fashionable. And then I started looking at a lot of different other types of anarchism. Because I was always going to the library and reading up on all these different the history of anarchism and different tendencies within anarchism, and checking out all sorts of generic sources, the encyclopedia and stuff like that. Again, this was before there was the internet. And the more I looked into all this, the more I discovered how many different tendencies there were within anarchism, and how interesting anarchist history actually was, and how many other types of philosophies there were. I started delving deeper into this and trying to put all these ideas together and look for other movements out there that had similar ideas. And then along the way, I was involved with other projects. I was a part of the radical left in the 80s and the 90s. I was involved with the Libertarian movement in the United States and elements of the radical right. And then in the 21st century, I started looking at things like national anarchism and the European right and things like that. And the work that I do today is really the culmination of all that. I've never really renounced anything that I've ever been into in the past. I've just sort of viewed each thing as a building block or a stepping stone.
Yeah, totally get that. That's actually a great sort of introduction. I was like,
sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I just want to say I think it's really, really awesome because you were saying about how in the 80s, I think Dan and I come from a generation, we're kind of spoiled in the way that this information is so readily available to us now, that it almost comes to us not automatically, but through the things like Wikipedia, where you start clicking on links and finding people, it comes really, really easy to us. So it's definitely really impressive that you would have all this all these things happen when you have to go and really work on it and seek it out, you know. Whereas now it's like I go on YouTube and I can have like 100 videos come up.
Yeah, going to the libraries become like a sort of dead concept
Yeah,
these days.
but you know, it's interesting, you know, having to go through that to really, really get something, and it shows, you know, a sort of passion, you know.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I think in some ways you miss out on certain things by not going to the library. You know, I know I would go to the library and find all sorts of obscure books. When I was looking at anarchist history, I remember finding all these obscure books that were written in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, about anarchists as they were then. I remember seeing this one study on the classical anarchist movement that was written by a German judge around 1910. I remember reading a report about the Haymarket incident in the 1880s. It was written by a Chicago police captain in something like 1886 or whenever it was. All this obscure old stuff. And you know, back then in North America, back then there were only about a half a dozen anarchist publications, print publications, and if they came out something like twice a year, that was considered good. I remember there was this one publication that came out of St. Louis that, you know, they might publish 3 times a year, and it was considered unbelievable that they actually could get their publication into some mainstream bookstores. And that was the best there was. You know, if you wanted to correspond with other anarchists, you had to do it by the postal mail, which would take you know, days or weeks at a time even.
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of times your letters would get lost in the mail. You know, anarchists, at least back then, tended to be very transient people, so they might not be at one
Yeah.
address this month that they were and last month. Yeah, so it's definitely a different world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We do enjoy sometimes, like when I get a rare Saturday off, we enjoy going to the second-hand bookshops and trying to pick up. It's incredible, some crazy first editions of certain things you can pick up in some of these old dusty bookshops. You know, the kind of ones they have in Glasgow and the West End, where there's like cats lying on lying all over the shop, and the books are all just piled up. But if you take the time to go through them, sometimes you find some
Yeah.
incredible things for.
So that's like our library, because our actual library, our state-run library, by the way, it's terrible. you wouldn't really find stuff like that there. So.
Oh yeah, well I always found the state-run libraries to be awful. There's very little information of use I ever found in those. I would find a lot of stuff in university libraries, which, you know, many universities are run by the state. Um, but as far as the secondhand bookshops, I know exactly what you're saying. I know when I was younger, I used to go to those myself quite a bit and would find all sorts of obscure bits of literature. I know in the 80s I used to go and find a lot of old radical literature from the 60s that was still being sold during that time period. You know, all these obscure old books from people like the Black Panthers and all that from, you know, from the 1960s. So yeah, I picked up a lot from those venues as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's a brilliant. I can spend whole days in bookshops. But Keith, so we went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but it's okay. What we want to ask though is, can you explain pan-anarchism to our audience?
Well, pan-anarchism is a type of idea that I came up with really just to describe all the different types of anarchism that there are, and, as well as a lot of overlapping philosophies and ideologies. I mentioned earlier that over the years I observed a lot of different types of anarchist movements, and I read a lot about the history of anarchism and got deep into anarchist theory. And what I found was that there were about as many different types of anarchists as there were people who claimed to be anarchists. I've heard it said that there are about as many different types of anarchists as there are other political philosophies put together. And I also noticed that these different types of anarchists would spend a lot of time fighting with each other, a lot of sectarian rivalries among different types of anarchists. So I wanted to take a different approach. I wanted to uh, create some kind of forum where anarchists of different types could be brought together, and people from overlapping philosophies can be brought together, and really political dissidents of any kind, or just people who were curious of any kind, could come to some kind of forum where we could discuss some of these kinds of ideas and work on building greater unity and solidarity among anarchists. And that's really what AttackTheSystem.com is about, and what it was about when I started that. I started that project about 14 years ago, and the idea there is to create a forum where you can bring any idea to the table that you want. There are a lot of different hyphenated types of anarchism, and a lot of the different schools of anarchism often seem to care more about hyphens than they do the anarchism. There's the anarcho-communists seem to care more about communism than anarchism sometimes, and the anarcho-capitalists seem to care more about capitalism than anarchism at times, and it's true for all the other forms as well.
Yeah.
So what I like to do is say instead of focusing on all these things that we argue about, let's focus on the things that we agree on. Now, what's been ironic about that is that that this approach hasn't been popular with a lot of people. There are a lot of people out there in anarchist circles and other radical circles who don't like the fact that I maintain this open forum, or I'm trying to create this kind of pan-anarchist movement or this kind of pan-radical alliance, because they don't like the fact that I include this group or that group or people with these ideas, and they'll say things like, well, what are you doing with those people, or why are you talking to those people? But that's not the approach that I like to take at all. I think really if anarchism has any meaning at all, among its first principles would have to be the principles of free inquiry and the marketplace of ideas and the open exchange of ideas and a fair hearing for a contending point of view. And that's something that political radicals are famous for forgetting about, and including anarchists, unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, I totally agree, because, well, like, I would say, I notice, like, I lean towards the anarcho-capitalist sort of side of things, and I know a lot of people who have read stuff like Rothbard and stuff like that, but then they've never read, like, Bakunin or Malatesta or Emma Goldman, and even though obviously they're not anarcho-capitalists, they're still anarchists, and there's still so much you can get out of their writing, as an anarchist, and I think that some of these anarcho-capitalists I know who don't even entertain that side of anarchist literature, I think they're missing out really on a lot of important philosophy in a really big way.
Well, sure. I mean, there's a lot you can get from the classical anarchist writers that's still relevant today. I mean, some of that stuff is anachronistic now. There's a lot of talk in some of that literature, the old anarchist literature from the 19th century, about the workers' struggle and about social conditions as they were in the 19th century, and
bombs and things, and murders and things like that.
They had some pretty intense personalities in some of those in some of those circles in those days. And a lot of that, a lot of the stuff that they wrote about was obviously relevant to their own time, and in a way that that's not relevant now. But at the same time, a lot of the stuff that they talked about is very relevant to our own time, particularly their criticisms of the state. If we go back and we read the criticisms of the state that you find in the writings of the 19th century anarchists, and then look at the 20th century and look at what the state became in the 20th century, and look at the kinds of regimes that emerged in the 20th century, we see that some of the thinkers like Proudhon and Bakunin and Malatesta and Emma Goldman and others, that Kropotkin, were very prescient in their predictions in terms of where the state, the modern state, was headed. Related to that is war. There's a lot of criticisms of war and imperialism and militarism in classical anarchist writing, and look at what's happened in the world since then. So a lot of that, a great deal of bearing on where we are today.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and it is one thing I always think about, because Katie always talks to me about, like, sometimes we discuss, like, women's suffrage and things like that, and she always, like, every time she hears any feminist talking, she always thinks back to that great Emma Goldman article, and she wasn't criticizing, like, for example, the suffragettes in, like, England. She was more saying that it's misplaced because there was countries at the time where there was women in parliament, but things were just every bit as bad, and she was trying to argue that it doesn't matter what gender is in parliament, it doesn't matter, or whatever, it's the state, it's the organisation itself that is the problem, and I thought it was quite revolutionary for her time.
Yeah, well, Emma Goldman, had a collection of essays called Anarchism and Other Essays that was published in 1910. It was originally, these were essays that were originally in her journal, Mother Earth, an anarchist magazine that she edited. And then that collection of essays was actually reissued by my publisher recently, and the publisher asked me to write a new introduction to that book. And so I wrote a rather lengthy introduction. And one thing that I actually discussed in the introduction is some of her views on feminism, which it's ironic because as one who has gone through the educational system here in North America through higher education, through the university systems and graduate schools and all that. Which obviously is education, academia in the United States leans very much towards the left, particularly in humanities fields. And Emma Goldman is widely promoted as having been a pioneer feminist and all of that. That's really what she gets recognized for in the academic world. But if you actually go back and read what she had to say about women's suffrage and all of that, she was actually skeptical of that early on. One thing that she was concerned about in the United States is that if women got the vote, that middle class and socialist women would vote to expand the state in a lot of different ways. One of them was through so-called victimless crimes, or what's called sanctuary legislation and laws against alcohol and gambling and drugs and that kind of thing. And ironic that when the women's suffrage amendment was actually passed, the amendment to the Constitution in the United States that gave women the right to vote. Right after that, the amendment that enacted alcohol prohibition was passed, and that amendment passed in large part because of the not entirely obviously, but in part because of the female vote. And like you were saying, and there are parts of the world where women have a lot of, like I think in some of the Scandinavian countries now they have a majority women in the parliaments. And yet those are very state-centric, very paternalistic societies.
The Nordic model in particular is a very kind of socialistic model that's got all over Scandinavia.
So we see that the state really has continued to expand, irrespective of who's in power. And it's it's not just the issue of women's suffrage. In a lot of a lot of modern politics in the Western world, we see that even as more and more traditionally disadvantaged groups that have been discriminated against in the past, like say racial minorities or gay people or workers or whomever, even as their social standing has improved, the state has continued to expand. It's almost like the state. In fact, I'm sure that the state does go out and just and seek more and more constituencies to cultivate for the sake of expanding its own power. When people like us come along and we say no, we want to get rid of this altogether. We're advocating a whole new paradigm and pushing things in a totally different direction.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're just kind of it's just too much for some people. Like I notice on television. Sorry, I notice on television, like you can have sort of any debate you want about what size of government, but we always start from the premise that, well, government exists first, and then it can be as big or as small as you want, but as long as there's government, yeah, fine. which leads me kind of to my next point, because I wanted to ask you about, because you talk about, obviously you talk about pan-secessionism, which is different, but we have this referendum coming up in Scotland in September, and they call it an independence referendum, and that's how they bill it. But all it is basically more powers for the already existing Scottish government, because they want to keep the pound as the currency. So right from the get-go, you're still in hock to the Bank of England, central banking. They want to remain a part of the EU, and I've looked for a long time to try and get an accurate number, and nobody seems to have one of how many of our laws in this country are actually made by the European Union Parliament. But the estimates are so bad, they're between 5 and 50%, and that's just ridiculous. And then the other third problem is that they want to keep the monarchy, and I know it's only a figurehead and stuff, but it is a real waste of taxpayers' money when you see these parasites, it's another way to say it, these parasites, promenading about in their finery. So that's my rant about Scottish independence. But yeah, just your thoughts on like recent secession movements. I know there was one in Venice as well, I believe.
Well, I'm obviously very much in favor of secession, and the reason that I became interested in that was I was always looking for strategies that anarchists could use to advance their ideas. I noticed that a lot of anarchists tended to be pretty good at philosophy and history and social criticism and economics and different kinds of things like that. But a lot of anarchists, or very few, really pay much attention to strategy. The question of, well, how do we actually do this? How do we get from point A to point B? Whenever I would ask anarchists about this, I come up with a lot of, I'd hear a lot of answers that weren't really satisfactory, or which I thought were somewhat anachronistic. So I started thinking about the concept of secession. Where I actually got the idea for secession as a strategy was in the late 1990s in the United States. I was involved with some of the what's called the Patriot movement, which were basically these anti-government groups that emerged usually from the political right during that time, out of concern for things like erosion of civil liberties and declining economic conditions. But it was in that milieu that I first came across secession groups, that is, people that wanted to split the United States up into smaller countries, and I didn't even know anything like that actually existed. Of course, culturally speaking, in the United States, we have this something of a tradition of secessionism. We had the 13 colonies that broke away from King George III in 1776, and then we had an attempted secession by the southern region from the rest of the United States in the mid 19th century, and that didn't turn out so well. But we have seen in the United States a growth of interest in secession movements. I think opinion polls consistently show that maybe 1 in 5 Americans believes in the right of regions to separate and form a separate territory or separate country if they wish. I don't know how many Americans actually advocate for that. It's probably less than that, but about 1 in 5 at least think the idea is acceptable. Um, and and we've seen the growth of secession movements in North America in recent years. There's going to be a referendum on the ballot in California. I think this year or next year about the possibility of splitting California up into 6 different states. And California, of course, is one of the largest American states, and it's a situation similar to what you're describing because it's not really about these California leaving the United States altogether. They would still be part of the United States under the American government, under the U.S. Congress. They'd still use the American currency and all of those things as well. So it's a very similar situation to what you're describing with the possibility of Scottish independence. But at the same time, even though some of these secession movements that have emerged in recent times are somewhat wishy-washy, somewhat middle of the road in their ideas, I think they do open the door for more radical forms of secessionism to develop in the future. And there are in the United States movements that want to secede from the USA altogether and form independent nations, separatist breakaway nations. One is Vermont. There's a movement in Vermont. It's not a majority. They don't actually have political power in Vermont at this time. But there's a movement in Vermont to make the state of Vermont, into an independent nation, which it was back in the late 18th century. And also in Texas, there's a movement of that, and Texas was once an independent nation as well in the early to mid 19th century. And of course, I know people who are involved in the Southern secession movement here in the U.S. There are people who wish for that region to become independent as well. So I think that over time we will probably see the growth of more and more secession movements as political discontent rises. Opinion polls in the U.S. show that political discontent is at an all-time high, and that regard for public institutions is at an all-time low. I think Congress consistently has an approval rating that's in the single digits, and I think the president's isn't that bad, but it's not good either. So I see secession as a vehicle for the promotion of the idea that political power, should be decentralized to the lowest level possible, and that we don't have to have people under the same political roof who don't like each other. We can all go our separate ways.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is again, you were talking about maybe like the South seceding, but what I think has been really interesting is there's been so much disinformation about the American Civil War. Like there's a whole lot of things that are never mentioned, like the fact that it wasn't fought over slavery. There was a lot of other factors and things like that, and there was also like black slave owners and things like that. And I think that's kind of interesting how it's been painted in a sort of different light in mainstream history. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, wars and political controversies are always more uh, complex than what the conventional narratives will typically allow for. And in the case of the war between the American states, where the southern region tried to claim independence, there were a lot of different factors that went into that. I think that a lot of it was a cultural conflict. I think that the South tended to be much more European in a cultural sense, whereas the North tended to be more American in the sense that it really did create a type of new culture that was uniquely American. In some ways, you could say it was more like the old world versus the new world in a way. As far as the issue of slavery, it's true that there were black slave owners in the South. There were also the main objective that the Lincoln government, that the government of Abraham Lincoln had at the time, who was the president of the United States, was to preserve the Union. They wanted to keep the Union together. And Lincoln himself once said that was his objective. He said if he could do it, he said if it was necessary to liberate the slaves in order to preserve the Union, he would. But he certainly didn't see that as a necessary objective. He always made it clear that the preservation of the Union was the objective behind that particular war. And also, it has to be recognized that the racism that was that's in the South that's always pointed to was often just as virulent in other parts of the United States at the time. For example, there were some northern states. I think the state of Ohio actually barred immigration from blacks altogether. And some of the territories that barred slavery did so not because they were friendly towards the black folks who were kept as slaves, but because they didn't want any blacks in their territories altogether. So racism in 19th century America was virulent, and it was something that existed all across the spectrum. So it wasn't just a Southern thing at all. And there were a lot of other issues involved. There were a lot of other taxes, tariffs, things like that had been imposed on the North imposed on the South by the North. Of course, the North had the upper hand politically.
Oh yeah, and to sort of round off our talk about like secessionism, what do you think it would really take for an American state to actually secede from the U.S. completely? Like, what would that take? Because I've been trying to think, and I think
Well,
I don't know.
I think it would take more than just for an individual state to secede. I think that the American regime would never allow a single state to secede. I think it would have to be something that was much larger than that. It would have to be something that was comparable to what happened to the Soviet Union.
Like a total collapse.
Yeah, in the late 80s and early 90s, where the system just couldn't continue and it basically just fell apart. And the Soviet republics all seceded and became independent nations. The nations that were the vassalages in Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact countries, got their independence and overthrew their respective communist regimes. And I think it would have to be something more on that level.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Another thing I wanted to ask you, Keith, because I've noticed from looking around, I've noticed that you've received, well, I would say some criticism, because like what you on AttackTheSystem.com you talk about having like all kinds of groups together. So you've got like even like sort of white nationalist groups and things like that. And I remember in listening to one of your podcasts, you were even talking about like alliances with street gangs and things like that. Can you expand on that a bit and why you think that's important to really bring in everyone, like even people we consider to be really fringe groups, like some people like street gangs and things?
Uh-huh. Well, it depends on the group you're talking about. I mean, to answer that question thoroughly, a lot of it would come down to the specific circumstances and group in question and what their ideas are and things like that. Now, as far as street gangs, in the United States, we have a massive street gang population. There's probably several million of them, and they're probably split off into tens of thousands of different groups. Many of these groups view themselves as independent nations. They even call themselves a nation, or some of them view themselves as the equivalent of a religion. I've heard some of these guys describe themselves, I remember hearing a member of one of these gangs one time, one of the more prominent gangs, say, why do they call us a gang? They don't call the Christians a gang. So clearly he thinks his gang is yeah, he thinks his gang is the equivalent of a world religion, a historic religion.
Yeah, well, like the government's not a gang.
Right, yeah. Well, that's been that's more or less how I tend to look at it, in the sense that St. Augustine, the church father, said that what is the state but a robber band writ large, or something like that, and that's really what the state is. And I see all of these other groups as sort of systems of counter power, if you will, or alternative infrastructure to the state. It's groups that are going off and building their own infrastructure that is in direct opposition to the state, or in many ways contributing to the weakening of the state, particularly something like gangs that are so radically opposed to the existing power structure. As far as some of these other groups, some of these kind of separatist groups that are based on ethnicity and religion and things like that, again, it's the same issue, in the sense that many of these people are extremely opposed to centralized authority. Many of them are not, most of them are not anarchists. They might have totally different reasons for opposing the state as it currently exists. They may view the state as oppressing them or attacking them. They may not necessarily be against the state as a matter of principle or something like that. But there are large undercurrents of this kind of thing in the United States, of different kinds of movements that do regard themselves as under attack by the state, as in opposition to the state, to the existing political order. And my message to all of that kind of stuff is, it doesn't have to be either or. We don't have to all submit to the state, and we don't all have to like each other either. We can all go our different directions. We can all have our own communities, our own institutions, our own organizations, our own movements, where we more or less do our own thing. And it can be polar opposite of our different beliefs in many ways. For example, take the different schools of anarchism. I think that in an anarchist society there could be anarcho-capitalist institutions and communities and enclaves and regions and provinces, and there could be anarcho-communist communities, and there can be ethnically homogenous communities and ethnically heterogeneous communities, and there can be religious-oriented communities and secular ones, and those that are socially or culturally somewhat conservative, and those that are just very free form, libertine, like the red light district in Amsterdam or something like that. Right? Yeah. I mean, I don't believe that there has to be any kind of cultural or philosophical homogeneity to make anarchism work. In fact, I think anarchism is the polar opposite of that. It's anarchism is interesting in that it's one of the few philosophies that can include things that are otherwise polar opposites of one another. Where the controversy comes in, obviously, is that obviously many of the kinds of people and groups that I deal with are extremely controversial in their own right. Many people dislike them a great deal. Anarchists themselves have a lengthy history of being in conflict with some of them. And yeah, that in turn raises a lot of people's eyebrows, and they're like, well, what are you doing talking to those people? But what I do is I try to take the core ideas behind anarchism as I understand it, and I try to bring it into lots of different kinds of population groups and lots of different other movements and lots of different issue-oriented groups, including groups that historically or traditionally don't have any kind of relationship to anarchism. There are some anarchists from the left, for example, who have no problem collaborating with Marxists because both groups, the classical anarchists and the Marxists, even though they're polar opposites in many ways, were both parts of the radical labor movement at an earlier time. So you still see that today. You'll see anarchists and Marxists out there in the same demonstration over the same issues and that kind of thing. But there are some of these same anarchists, if you try to do outreach to, say, groups from the political right, they lose their minds. They say, what are you doing talking to those awful people? But I don't really approach it from that kind of angle. Any political organization, any movement, any institution, any individual that I encounter, I look at it like, okay, what does this individual person stand for? Or what does this particular group stand for? What are their actual goals? Where do I agree with them? Where do I disagree with them? To what degree can my views and theirs be reconciled? To what degree can they not be reconciled? And I often prefer to focus on the commonalities rather than the differences. And obviously many people don't look at it that way. I mentioned earlier, even among anarchists, you find a lot of sectarian rivalries about who's the true anarchist and who aren't, and things like that. But yeah, I tend to take.
It's interesting.
But I tend to take an opposite approach, and that makes me unpopular in some circles, and popular in others. But it is what it is.
Yeah, I think anarchy and sort of the libertarian ideology for me anyway is very accepting of just listen. I don't care who you are, where you're from, what you do. Just don't bug me. Just leave me alone. Sort of stay out of my way and don't hurt anybody. That's sort of where I come from. I know that's a very, very kind of almost a childish kind of way to make it like, explaining it to like a 6-year-old.
But yeah, as well, like I totally agree with like the idea of like let people do what they like, because the state tries to sort of put a one-size-fits-all mold on all of us, and even just walking about any kind of modern Western city, you see that there's different communities. Like we have a really large like Pakistani community here, and it's actually great because we get some of the best like Punjabi kind of cooking. It's amazing, right? But like it's just walk through any city and you see all these different little communities that are around, and that kind of shows you that this kind of statist one-size-fits-all model it doesn't work, and pan-anarchism makes so much more sense because people could have their own communities where they live, by their values with people who think like them.
Yeah, and it's a way of avoiding conflict as well. In the United States, a major aspect of our domestic politics involves rivalries between different cultural groups that are trying to control the central government. You have the left on one hand, the right on the other, and both of them are consistently trying to gain the upper hand politically to impose their own values on the wider society, and then prevent the other side from imposing their values on themselves. And a lot of the political discourse in the United States is about that kind of stuff. And my thing has always been, well, it doesn't need to be that way. Everybody can just go their own way and do their own thing, and it doesn't need to be some kind of universal system that imposes one point of view on everyone else.
Yeah, I kind of feel like it's almost like they have a gun to our head and they're like screaming, "Get along!" Everybody just get along, and we're just like, look, just stop telling us like what to think, because that's just how it feels to me anyway.
Well, we had David Cameron, Nicolas Sarkozy, Angela Merkel all coming out at the one time saying multiculturalism doesn't work, and then not saying anything about it. It was kind of I don't know if you saw that. It was quite a few years ago, but it was quite bizarre.
Yeah. For a time, a lot of I remember that very well. A lot of the European prime ministers were coming out and saying, well, multiculturalism has failed, and they're talking about problems with assimilating immigrants and things like that. But the reason that that's such a problem is because you have all of these diverse populations that are under the same political roof. So you have a system where the state is trying to be everything to everyone and ends up being nothing to no one, and yet everybody's still got to be a part of the same system. And I know with multiculturalism, I think that's really been more of an issue in some of the European countries than it has been in the United States, at least until recently. America's always been sort of a multicultural society, but what happened was initially when there were large waves of immigration being experienced in Europe, they would say, well, okay, we don't want to be prejudicial, we don't want to be racist or ethnocentric, so we won't encourage assimilation, we'll encourage multiculturalism. And then the authorities started becoming concerned, well, that was creating too much internal disharmony in terms of separatist type communities popping up and that kind of thing. So then they started going in the other direction, saying, oh no, everybody's got to become French or everybody's got to become German or something like that. And neither approach really works very well. I think it's far better to just let everyone go their own way and do their own thing.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I mean, it's funny actually because like you're talking about like how sort of different anarchists and like anarchism is just a huge spectrum. But me and Katie were talking one day and we're talking about how we have so much more in common with like say an anarcho-communist than we would have with like a state communist.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean? Yeah, it's funny. It's just like it's because we identify the common enemy, but it doesn't always happen.
Yeah, I was actually having a discussion about that today with one of the contributors to AttackTheSystem.com, and he was saying that it's interesting that anarchism and communism are both considered ideologies of the far left, to the point that even some of the left anarchists, they get confused. Even today I'll come across some of the anarcho-communists, for example, who really think that they and the Marxists are somehow cousins or something like that. But I think that a better way to look at it would be that, on one end of the political spectrum you have anarchism, which is the total removal of state control. And on the other end, you have total state control, which would be communism on one end and fascism on the other. Communism and fascism really are really closer to each other. It's interesting because even though they're mortal enemies with one another, and whenever they meet, they get into bloody battles with each other. But it's really sort of like a family feud. It's
I totally agree. I've always thought that is totally state, central control. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and they're really so similar in a lot of ways. And in fact, I once had a conversation with Stanley Payne. He's a historian, and he's one of the most recognized historians of most widely recognized historians of historical fascist movements. And he told me that he thought that communism and fascism were actually very similar. They had this kind of very state-centric, revolutionary ideology that rejects, bourgeois society as its principal goal, and wants to have this kind of radically new, reconstructed society. There are certainly points of disagreement in other theoretical ways, but they're also extremely similar in many ways. And in fact, fascism was founded by former Marxists, including Mussolini himself.
Oh yeah, he was. Yeah. Sorry.
yeah, exactly. So it's interesting how the spectrum, the left-right model of the spectrum is so awkward in many ways.
And absolutely, and I think it's kind of like the left-right thing is sort of, especially in kind of modern politics, the lines are being incredibly blurred. Now it's just basically one thing, and I think people are starting to sort of wake up to that. But what I wanted to ask you as well is like a strategy for the future, because like if you kind of look about the sort of stuff that we look at, you hear things like Adam Kokesh is talking about running for president in 2020 for what he calls a peaceful dissolution of the American government. And then on the other hand, you have Stefan Molyneux saying things like, this is a multi-generational project and we should focus on, raising our children right so that they won't buy into this stuff. What do you think, like, is the strategy for the future if we're to achieve statelessness?
Well, I certainly think it's a long-term project, and I think that quick-fix solutions like getting someone elected president is not the way to go.
I agree.
I think that, I think that, like I was saying earlier, the way that we've seen other ideas that started off as really radical fringe ideas that many people thought were crazy, all of a sudden finding their way into the mainstream and becoming normalized, I think in many ways is a model to follow, like marijuana decriminalization or like gay marriage. Now, obviously, abolishing the state is a much bigger issue than any of that. But I think that the goal, that the first thing is, I think there needs to be more of us. We just need to get the idea out that get the anarchist ideas, the libertarian ideas out to as many people as possible. And now, because we have things like the internet and a lot of tools that we didn't have when I started this, that does make it a lot easier to get the message out. And I think the goal should be to grow all of the anarchist tendencies and all of the anti-state movements, the anarcho-communists, the anarcho-capitalists, and all the others, and continue to grow these movements until they do become large and they do become influential, and simultaneously have practical measures like working on movements to decentralize political power, to create breakaway political units from central authority, as well as to attack individual state policies, whether it's laws against guns or, laws against certain kinds of food or laws against drugs or, whatever it is. I mean, there's so many things like that. There's so many things like that we can attack. Corporate welfare that tends to centralize economic power, central banking, war, obviously, is a big one, and many other things. I mean, we could go on about that forever. So attacking individual state actions and policies, creating movements to decentralize state power, as well as the whole educational process of educating more and more people about why the state is a bad idea, why it is a negative thing. And I think that a big part of it is to simply demystify the state. Keep in mind that in the ancient world, people believed that the state was literally divine. That in the ancient Egyptian civilization, for example, they thought the pharaoh was the sun god. As recently as the mid 1940s, the Japanese believed the emperor was a god. He after Japan was defeated in World War II, he actually went on the radio and said, look, people, I'm not a god. People were still believing that even in the 20th century. So I think demystifying the state, and we've seen that process happen over the centuries. Most people don't believe the emperor is a god. People don't really believe in the divine right of kings anymore. Instead, the state gets its legitimacy from ideas like the social contract theory or mass democracy. Well, we had this election, 5 years ago, or whatever. So, and this party won, so the state is legitimate. I think attacking that idea, all the different kinds of institutional concepts and like mass democracy and that kind of stuff that are used to legitimize the state today, the social contract theory and all of that. I think once you debunk all of that, the state is left with, as being the emperor that doesn't have any clothes on.
Yeah.
Oh no, and I totally agree. And it's funny how, like you say, that nobody really believes in the divine right of kings anymore. And in Britain, though, it's more like, in terms of the monarchy, it's not they believe in the divine right of kings. It's more like they've got the Stockholm syndrome to a massive degree, people in Britain, because you wouldn't believe how just how insane people go for the monarchy. It's more in England, but you do get it in Scotland, and it still boggles my mind every time.
Well, I think the royal families are kind of like our celebrities in the United States. We've never had the royal culture in the United States. We've always been a republic. But we do have our Hollywood celebrities, and in some ways they're just like the royal families of Europe in that, they're celebrities who live lavish lifestyles and get themselves written up in the newspapers for all of their screw-ups and that kind of stuff and scandals and all the things they get into. It's, so it's really, I think it's really just sort of a different manifestation of celebrity culture.
Yeah, and imagine, I mean, if you can imagine that you saw that and then you thought, hey, I'm part of the reason that they're there. I'm paying for it,
Yeah, yeah.
It makes you pretty angry, at least in my opinion.
Uh-huh.
When you see the pomp and circumstance,
Yeah, well, I remember years ago seeing an interview with John Lydon or Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols, and of course, what made him famous were his songs that attacked the Queen and things like that. And that he was asked if his attitude towards the royal families had mellowed any over the years, and he said, no, not at all. He says, I pay taxes to finance those idiots. It's so I think if I were a citizen of one of the countries where all of that is still in place, I'd resent that.
Yeah, I know. The thing was actually after after God Save the Queen was released, it was like, obviously it was the 70s, and it was like there was a lot of threat of IRA terrorism and stuff, and somebody actually stabbed Johnny Rotten at the time, but then now he's on television selling Kerrygold butter in Britain. Yeah, that's what he does now, and it's kind of funny. But like sometimes, in a way, I think some people, when you say you're an anarchist, if you go there, I think it's easier to say you're a libertarian. They probably don't know what that means usually in Scotland, but when you say you're an anarchist, people automatically think of the Sex Pistols, and you go, well, they weren't exactly espousing anarchist theory. It was more just an angry reaction.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Well, it's a mixed bag. In America, if you say you're an anarchist, they tend to, if they have any idea what you're talking about, people will associate you with the punk rock subculture and all of that. Or if you say you're a libertarian, they'll here in the United States they'll often associate you with the political right, the Republicans and things like that, because some of them have appropriated that name for themselves. So there's really
Ron Paul.
yeah. Well, he was something of a maverick. He was something of a maverick politician, and we don't really have many of those. He was definitely an interesting character. But here in America, we have a lot of these supposed libertarian organizations that are really just an appendage to the Republican Party. And I'm sure there are groups like that serve the same roles, they say, for the Tories or something like that in England. And I don't really know about Scotland, but there's really no one perfect term to use. We could call it anything. We could call it autonomism or some of the libertarian anarchists in the U.S. use the term agorism. There was a term that Sam Kunkin came up with.
We're familiar, yeah.
Yeah, so but there's really no good word. But I think it's more the ideas that count. If you know how to communicate the ideas, the labels don't really matter that much.
Oh yeah, because we have obviously we've looked into the Libertarian Party in America, and there is a British Libertarian Party, but practically no one knows about them. But the problem I find is that they're still talking about a state, and they're basically minarchists. And I just think personally that the nature of government is to grow. I don't think that minarchism is possible. I can't see how that's possible in any way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have something of a relationship with the Libertarian Alliance, which is an English libertarian group, and I know Dr. Gabb.
Oh, do you? We've heard of him, yeah.
Yeah, and I actually interviewed him on my podcast once, and his organization actually gave me a prize for an essay I wrote for them a few years ago. But and I think their views seem to be a mixture. They seem to run the whole spectrum of more classical liberal kind of Tory-leaning libertarians all the way over to anarcho-capitalist, and I've even seen some anarcho-communist writing in their archives and things like that. But I'm all for a diversity of opinion and a diversity of tactics as well. We in the United States, we have these politicians, these conservative politicians who are always running for office saying, oh, well, we want to limit government. That's one thing they always say they want to do. And of course, whenever they get elected, they turn around and grow government, often at a more rapid pace than the left does.
Shocking, very shocking. Who saw that coming?
Yeah. and people still go and vote for them anyway. A lot of people still believe every word they say. So.
And that's the shame. I think that's the real problem, is that people sort of don't consider anarchism at all. It seems to me like, I mean,
it has to be right or left, you know. It's like they think they have to fit into one of those paradigms, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, and if you watch TV, you know, it's always like, it seems like the debate in Britain, and I'm sure it's the same in America, is like, oh, anything you want, just not no government. Like, you can debate endlessly about how government should be massive, it should be tiny, but don't start debating about no government. That's what we don't want you to talk about. Just debate about the size of it. You know, it's like, that's what you have to start from. You have to start from, there is a government exists. Let's just talk about how big it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, earlier I mentioned the secession movement that's growing in California, and the Republicans and the Democrats, the left and the right, have both come out, vociferously against that. Of course, it was the same way in the Spanish Civil War when the anarchists were involved in that. The one thing the fascists and the communists and the liberal democracies all agreed on was that had to be crushed. That's one thing that pulls all the different factions of statists together, is when they see the state actually being threatened.
Well, I think that's why it's important that we all come together, because the more we grow grow in numbers and we grow in power, and that's when things start to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I think I think you're right, and I think as anarchist movements grow and become more influential and publicly recognized, I think the state will become increasingly hostile. I think nowadays, I think a lot of folks in the state just look at people like us and think, well, just let them do what they want. They're nobodies. Who cares? Nobody.
They're no threat to us. Whatever.
Yeah, but if you're right, but if that were to change and people were to start listening to our message, I think the state might have an entirely different. In fact, I'm sure they would have an entirely different attitude. I think that the state would certainly move to repress anarchist movements that started to grow in size to the point that they were actually politically influential. So I agree that there does need to be a greater solidarity among anarchists of different types. I think anarchists. It's interesting how anarchists are a lot like organized religion in different ways. I mean, look at how many different sects of Christianity there are. I once heard that there's something like 23,000 branches of Protestantism alone.
That does not surprise me at all. It does not surprise me in any way. No.
It's crazy.
And anarchists in a lot of ways are just like that. There's so many different kinds of, there are about as many different types of anarchists as are individuals who claim to be anarchists, which, on one hand, isn't really surprising, because anarchists too tend to be very individualistic, and to a large degree that's what's healthy and positive about anarchism. But at the same time, it's possible to take that so far that that you lose sight of what's practical, and you forget who the enemy is, things like that.
Oh yeah, totally. And you mentioned the Spanish Civil War, and for anyone listening that has not read it, if you want to know about the Spanish Civil War, George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, it's one of my favorite books. Just an incredible piece of writing, just unbelievable. So Keith, we're going to start to wrap up now. But before we do, why don't you tell us about your books?
All right. Well, I have a couple of books that are available online. You can go to our website and order them at AttackTheSystem.com, or you can go to Amazon, or you can go to Black House Publishing and get them directly from the publisher. But I have a book called Attack the System, A New Anarchist Perspective for the 21st Century. It's a bit long. It's something like 470 pages. And it's a collection of essays that I wrote over a period of about 15 years or so on a lot of different topics involving anarchism. Part of it has to do with philosophers that have impacted my own thinking as an anarchist. Max Stirner was certainly one. Nietzsche was another. Ernst Jünger was another. There's a couple of chapters where I critique the international system, the global order, and things like that. I have a lot of chapters. About half the book is a critique of either the left or the right. I've got about 4 chapters in it where I really rip the right to shred, and then I think I have about 9 chapters where I'm really ripping the left to shreds. So And then I talk a little bit about my own approach to anarchist theory. I call it anarcho-pluralism or pan-anarchism and things like that. And then I start talking about some more tactical and strategic ideas, and I delve into some somewhat newer concepts, fourth generation warfare and that kind of thing, and a lot of different types of issues. But it's a pretty comprehensive work, and like I said, I wrote it over a period of about 15 years, so it does touch on a lot of different topics. That's one of the books, and then I also have another book called El Salvador: War by Proxy. What that was originally a research project I did in graduate school that I later turned into a book, and it's basically a history of the Civil War in El Salvador, the Central American nation of El Salvador in the early 1980s, and how that was and the relationship of that to American foreign policy. And I wrote about that because I was in the anti-war movement in the 1980s. One of the things I used to do quite a bit of activism around was opposing the United States war in Central America that was going on at the time. It was sort of like it was really the 80s version of the Vietnam War, and it was fought for it was done under the same kinds of pretenses. Supposedly it was a geopolitical thing done in the name of preventing Soviet expansionism, but it was really a war of imperial conquest, or it was very similar to what happened in Southeast Asia in the 60s. And I have been involved in that, and it's still a history that's not very well known, but it was a war that involved some really extreme violations of human rights, massacres of civilians in very large numbers, and it was all funded and carried out by the American government and its proxy armies and proxy states in Latin America. And I researched that quite a bit when I was in graduate school. I'd been an activist around this kind of stuff in the 80s. When I was in graduate school years later, I decided that would be my master's project, in that I would go and write a history of all of this. And then I published it a few years ago actually it was published last year, 2013, through my publisher, through Black House. And it really gives you I think that book really gives you a feel for what the state really is. If you want to see what the state is like when all of its cloaks and daggers and smoke screen, smoke and mirror, when the smoke and mirror show is over, this really shows the state when it really decides to reveal its fangs. It shows what the state's really all about. And it also, as an American, I wanted to write something that showed what American power is like for people on the other side of the receiving end, for people in the countries around the world that have been subject to American military aggression and domination and so forth. What it's like to be an El Salvadoran and experience this. So I wanted to make that available. That book's available through the website as well, and also from the publisher and on Amazon.
Yeah, and just tell us about the website. Tell us about AttackTheSystem.com and what people can find on there, Keith.
Okay, AttackTheSystem.com explores all the ideas that I've been talking about in this program. It's a forum where you can go and discuss anarchist theory in all of its different forms. It's a totally open forum. We don't censor anyone. Unless you're, advocating something that's going to get us in trouble with the law or something like that.
Of course, within reason.
But all opinions are welcome, and there are crazy ones that get posted from time to time, and it's also it also discusses a lot of different ideas related to anarchism and anarchist theory, a lot of contemporary events, including a lot of things, a lot of things that a lot of other anarchists don't talk about much. Some of that is some of the more obscure stuff is what I like to bring in. And then there's all sorts of links to all sorts of different dissident political organizations. If you want to see what the entire range of dissident opinion is like, left, right, anarchist, libertarian, whatever, we've probably got links to it somewhere. We've got a lot of archives of articles I've written over the years, of other associates of ours have written over the years on all sorts of esoteric topics related to anarchism, including some pretty controversial stuff. So it's just sort of a forum for all of these kinds of ideas.
That's awesome. Keith, we've really, really enjoyed having you on the show. It's been fantastic. You really are like, it's so fun. You're like this fountain of knowledge. It's like, it's just like, you just know so much stuff. It's amazing. So we just want to say, Keith Preston, thank you very much for being on the show. Dan, do you want to wrap this up for us?
Yeah, just thanks so much for being on the show, Keith. AttackTheSystem.com, and then obviously greeningoutpodcast.co.uk. Keith, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
It's been our pleasure.